So let's see where we got up to. I think we were on page A. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Did we get to Katan Cherish with Shota?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're on the left column on page A in our introduction to Tamura. And we established last time that we got together about a week ago that Cherichot Katan cannot create Tamura. However, there is, in the case of a Katan, an exceptional category, which is called Mufla Samach Le'ish. That means he passed his 12th birthday, he's in his last year before he's bar mitzvah, or in the case of a woman, she's 11, and she's in the last year before her bat mitzvah at 12. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth as to whether Mufla Samach Le'ish has the status of a gadol and can generate Tmura. And even according to that side of the Gemara, that Mufla, because basically Mufla Samach Le'ish is a status of Nidarim and Hegdesh. Hegdesh is always classified as Nidarim, correct? Right? Nidre Hegdesh. And he is empowered and upgraded to the status of an Ish once he's Mufla Samach Le'ish as far as the Nidarim are concerned and as far as Hegdeshos are concerned. And Tmura is another manifestation of Hekdeshos. So when he says Harei Zu Tmura Zu, he's basically generating in the Behemoth Chulin Hegdesh, the status of Hegdesh. And he can do that, according to one opinion in the Gemara, once he's a Mufla Samach Le'ish. However, there's another halacha of Gadlus, which is as far as Onshim are concerned. How are you? You want to use this chair and make yourself comfortable. If you want,
we're good.
All right, whatever. I don't know, the post-COVID era, I don't know who holds from what. Total confusion. Last night we had, I don't know, probably 50, 60 people and no one wore masks. So I don't know. This is the strangest thing is we go from Shalosh Shudas to Mincha. No, I'm sorry. We go from Shalosh Shudas to Myra. For Shalosh Shudas, no one's wearing a mask, and then they put it on for davening. So I said, what's like a gartel? You have to put on a gartel for davening?
Maybe they're eating a little bit.
I'm just saying, it's the whole thing just boggles my mind. But anyway, let's get back to this. So we have a concept called Mufla Samach Le'ish, and his Hegdesh is called Hegdesh. But he's not a bar onshin. And for Tmura, which is a violation of a lav of lo yimarenu, you get malchus. But he won't get malchus. So here's, for a quiz question, it'd be an interesting phenomenon. Where do you find the case of someone who could create Tmura, but in doing so, he doesn't incur a chiyuv malchus? That would be Mufla Samach Le'ish. Then he has another question. Would a katan be able to commission a gadol to do a tmura on his behalf? What does that mean? A katan has ownership. And that comes under the halacha of das acheres makim. But in any event, he has ownership. And according to one side, no, forget about one side. Everybody agrees that if he's not Mufla Samach Le'ish, he cannot do a Maisa Tmura. Can a gadol do a Maisa Tmura on the Behemas Chulin Shal Katan on behalf of the Katan? So if you take a look in footnote number Tzadi Gimel, he says that this is a suffix in the Minchas Chinu. He vacillates back and forth. And he makes it depend upon another case. Let's say a guy cannot do Tmura, but what happens if you have a Yisrael who was commissioned by the guy to do Tmura on a Behemoth school in Shalgad? And Tosa seems to assume that that might work. So even though the guy himself is not capable of doing a Tmura, the Yisrael can do the Tmura on behalf of the guy who owns the Behemoth school. And so too in the case of a Gadol who's doing a Maisa Tmura on behalf of Katan, because the Katan owns the animal that's cooling, it might work. And that's where the Minchas Chinuch vacillates.
To do with arms, or it's
Well, the question is there shlichus over here? How can you have shlichus in the case of a cotton? The cotton can't appoint a shliach, a guy can't appoint. So apparently the halach of Tmura does not fit into the mold, the classic mold of shlichus. Otherwise, how could a Yisrael operate as a commissioned agent on behalf of a Bachri? How can a gadol operate as a commissioned shliach on behalf of a katan? The whole thing is a pella. We're not operating with the laws and the restrictions that govern shlichus. So let me read it again. Yesh min achronim shenistapik is the minchas chinuch. The ofen shenasan hakot rishus l'gadol lahamid. Oh, you're tzad. Im hagadol otze tmura mikocho. Now it's interesting that he adds the word mikocho here. So you're on the left column of page 5, right? About the third paragraph. You see the last word in that paragraph is mikocho. That's a deliberate choice of a word. He could have said imagadol oset tmura kishlucho, but he doesn't say kishlucho, but mikocho, because shlichus would not operate here. There's no way that a gadol can be a shliach on behalf of a katan. The only exception to that rule, by the way, that I know of, is the Gemara in Kedushin about a father marrying off a girl to his son. Now, if it's a daughter and she's a ketana, then the Torah gave the father the das to be Makadesh, his daughter, who's a ketana. But in the case of a ben, he has a male son. How does that operate? What rights or by what mechanism does the father have the ability to effectuate a kedushin on behalf of his son? The Torah never gave him that right, so you're gonna have to operate midin shlichus, but ain't shlichus l'katan. So how does that work? And here also, in the case of Tmura, apparently Tmura is a different kind of a maisa. Every maisa that we're familiar with that lends itself to shlichus requires some sort of hakna, some sort of kinyan. Like I can appoint you to buy an animal on my behalf, so you're my shliach to do the kinyan, or kiddushin, which is also a kinyan. Or gittin is a kinyan, and that's where even truma, by the way, which is the source for shlichus in the Torah, atem gamatem l'rabot shlichachem, even there is hakna, because I'm makne the truma to the Kohen, not to any specific Kohen at this point, but to Shevet Kahuna. And now becomes Bailus of Shevet Kahuna. And therefore I can appoint a Shliach. But in this context, when we talk about Hegdesh, the truth is that Hegdesh is also a king. But it's Kedushas Mizbeach. See, if we were talking about Kedushas Damim, then I would understand shlichus kipshuta, because kedushas damim effectuates a kinyan, and it's moment hegdesh b'kinyana. But in the case of kedushas aguf, we're talking about kedushas karban. Then the Gemara says in kedusha meikara tura deruvim v'hashta tura deruvim. If I take an animal and I magdish it to a mizbeach, it still remains my animal. I don't lose my bailus over it. So to effectuate Tmura, which means that a Behemoth Chulin now becomes Hegdesh, that's not Kinyonin. And therefore, we're not talking about Torah Shlichus, because Shlichus is limited to Kinyonin. Like, for example, let's say we have Chanukah coming around the corner, right? Can I appoint you as my Shliach to fulfill the mitzvah of Chanukah on my behalf? And light my menorah. See, if it's Ishto, the Taz effectuates a Ishto Kigufo situation, which like is your goof, and she could light on your behalf. But what happens if I'm asking you to light on my behalf? Logically, it would not be effective, because it's no shlichus for mitzvahs. I can't ask you to put tefillin on for me. I can't ask you to be mekayim a mitzvah on my behalf, where it sits on my behalf for anything. So how would you understand the possibility of appointing a shliach to light Chanukah? Unless the mitzvah is not the hadlaka, maybe the mitzvah is just to guarantee that there be a nair in the Doluk, right? If it's near Doluk, then maybe you could understand how Shlichus operates. And maybe that itself is Pertsuve Nisa, right? The Ner Doluk is Pertsuve Nisa, and therefore you can do it on my behalf. In my bias, you get to Pesach HaSomach L'Chatzero, whatever it is there. Somach L'Shus HaRabim, But in any event, the bottom line is that what we're learning here is an unbelievable chiddush, that to create Hegdesh through Tmura requires a valid Maisa Tmura, even without Shlichus. As long as it's Mikocho. Mikocho means he steps aside, the owner of the animal, and he says, you know what? I want you to effectuate on my behalf a Tmura. And it's not Mitaret Shlichus. Okay, now about Shogeg. In general, the classic case of Tmura, and he gets Malchus for violating Tmura, is amazing. But what about a Shogeg? The man doesn't realize that this is prohibited. Had he known it was prohibited, he would never have done it. He could only hold him guilty for his ignorance. He should have studied more properly. Hatmura chala af b'shogeg. Shogeg meaning he made a mistake. He didn't realize the repercussions of his actions. Now watch what happens here. He's got two behemos of Hegdesh. One is an Ola, one is a Shlom. Who ratza lahamir behemas Ola? But instead he made a mistake and he was Meimir the behemas Shlomim. This is a whole different case than the one that I mentioned to you. Classic Shogeg means he's unaware of the violation. He doesn't know that what he's doing is prohibited. A man, eats chelev. He doesn't realize it's chelev. He thinks it's shumon. That's a classic Shogeg. He forgot it was Shabbos and he did a malacha. But here we're talking about a person who wants to be Meimir, but not this animal, which is Ola. He wants to be Meimir Shlomim or vice versa. And he simply makes a mistake. On the one hand, we would weigh in that this is Tmura, it's a valid Maisa Tmura, because he did have in mind to be Meimir. Yeah, but Meimir what? Meimir means to attach a certain Kedushas Mizbeach to a Behemas Chulin. Which Kedushas Mizbeach? Ola and Shlomim are two different worlds, two different entities. An Ola is Kula Kolil, a Shlomim is Nechal Shnei Yom V'Lailachas, it's Nechal Bailim, and so forth and so on. It doesn't require tzafon. You can go on and on. And yet, the Gemara derives from a pasuk that even in this case, the Maisa is a Maisa Tmura. And Rabbi said that again proves our very point that we're not operating with the classic halachas of kinyanim and das. This is not das. He doesn't want to be Meimir Ola. He wants to be Meimir Shlomim. So what happened? He taught the Maisa Tmura. He made a boo-boo. The Omar, and he enunciated Tmura Shlomim. And he has actually a Behemoth Shlomim right in front of him. Hareya Tmura Chala. In such a case, the Tmura is valid. Does he quote the pasuk here? No. V'chein im hayeshogeg be'isur hatmura. Oh, now the classic case of shogeg. He didn't realize that the Torah prohibits the act of tmura, v'lo yomer also. So yisaver shemuta lahamer. This is what we call omer muta. Harei tmura chala. What do you mean? I would never have done this tmura if I knew that there was an iser of Bal Yemer. I did it out of ignorance. He tells you to look in the Gemara. I think it says Yud Zayin here. I don't know. It's hard to read. It's a little bit erased. And then he quotes the Kesef Mishnah at the beginning of Tmura. The Kesef Mishnah writes that there's a machlokas amoraim whether or not Omer Mutter is included under Tmura, is a valid Tmura. According to one Mandiyama, That's only as far as Malchus is concerned. That the status of Shogeg Kemezi applies in an Omer Mutter, al Divrei Kol Chalat. So now let's just review before the Kesef Mishnah and after the Kesef Mishnah. Before the Kesef Mishnah, we assumed that when Tmura is valid betos, it means that he mistakenly called it a Tmuras Shlomim instead of a Tmuras Olam. But as far as Omer Mutter is concerned, that's already a different question. Meaning, would there be a ribui? We have a special ribui, he doesn't tell you the possible, that includes Shogeg in Tmura, as a valid Tmura, which is the case of Ol and Shlomim. Does that ribui include even in the case of Omer Mutter, where his mistake was that he didn't realize that this was illegal? It was a criminal act. Comes along the Kesef Mishnah, and he says that everybody agrees that that ribui, to validate the Tmura, applies not only in the case of Shlomo and Ola, but also in the case of Omer Mutter. That was never an issue. Don't even bother going down that road and questioning whether or not Tmura is valid in the case of Omer Mutter. It definitely is valid in the case of Omer Mutter. When the Gemara vacillates about Omer Mutter and Tmura, it was about whether or not he gets Malchus. Okay, he did a Maisa Tmura, but he didn't know it was Asur, so do you give him Malchus in such a case? There was never an issue about this. The Tmura is valid. In other words, the thrust of and the logic of the Kesef Mishnah is that if you're telling me that he wanted Ola and he got Shlomim in the deal, and yet that's valid, then what difference does it make whether he knows it's Mutter or he knows it's Asur? There's a Maisa Tmura, it was a full-fledged Maisa Tmura. He said, Harei Zu, Tmura Zu, or Chalufa Zu. And it's certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, is a valid Tmura. You want to know whether he should get punished for that? That's a question. I don't know why he should get punished. I mean, by the way, just on a philosophical level, the guy thinks it's mutter. We have such a thing with regard to akum, by the way. The akum, you have 7 mitzvahs. I don't have to tell you that. And shogig is kemezi, which means that if a guy says, I didn't know about the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, he will still be held responsible. And he's going to be put to death. What do you mean you don't know? How can you not know? You're a Ben Noach, you have to know all the 7 mitzvahs of Ben Noach. We require you to know that. Ignorance is not bliss in this case. But in Yisrael, with the 613 mitzvahs, Omer Mutter is a mitigating circumstance, and it removes your liability and your chiv malchus, with the exception of Tmura, in one side of the Gemara. Then in Tmura, you're going to be chai for Omer Mutter. Why? Why is that so? Oh, he should have learned all the halachas of Tmura. He didn't come to Rabbi Berzon's class introduction to Kodshim. So therefore he's guilty? I don't know. It's a Pella. Now he quotes the Lechem Mishnah. Another pshat in the Rambam, that even with regard to the validity of the Tmura, as far as it clones a Kedushas Mizbeach onto the Beis Chulin, that too was a machlokus, was an open-ended issue with contention and debate with regard to Omer Mutter. And again, it's a Pella when you think about it. Why should Omer Mutter have any impact on the Maisa Tmura? But the answer is it's a tos. He never would have done it if he would have known it was awesome. But then again, he never would have called it a Tmuras Ola if he knew that he was going to say Tmuras Ola, he wanted Tmuras Shlom. The strange case would be if he says Harezu Tmuras Ola u Tmuras Shlom. Let's say he would say he wants both. And then which would be Chal? By the way, is there a noise in here that I'm hearing? Oh, okay. I know if you have to stand for a moment,
The siren.
Yeah. He says, Umaskonas divreim notim ki kesef mishel divrei kol chala tmura the fact that he's guiltless, so to speak, because he's not aware of the avera, that's not going to impact on the validity of the tmura as a ma'aseh tmura. Which, by the way, it's another example of what we've spoken about so many times. You know, when we spoke about, let's say, all the psule kahuna. If the Kohen went ahead and he did the avoda, you know, when he was shasu yayin and all this kinds of stuff, and we asked two questions. Number one is whether the avoda is mechuleles, and number two, whether he gets punished for it or not. Misa b'dei shamayim. And again, we pointed out there were many cases where he would not be guilty, but yet the avoda would be mechuleles. Those are two different worlds. Here also, the issue of whether the tmura is valid or not is independent of the issue of whether he's guilty or not guilty, liable or not liable for violating the Isser Tmura. They're two separate issues. So Omer Mutter, according to Kesef Mishnah, was never an issue as far as the Ma'aseh Tmura is concerned. Omer Mutter is only a mitigating circumstance with regard to the liability, but it has nothing to do with the Ma'aseh Tmura. We haven't yet gotten to the sugya of Hasra yet. I think we should wait for that. If you ask me for my gut reaction, I would say the following, that if Omer Mutter is Chayav, then you don't need a Hasra, obviously. But at the end of the day, Omer Mutter is part from Malchus, although it is a valid Ma'aseh Tmura. So I would say then maybe you do need Malchus. I mean, you do need Hasra. Now he quotes the Ravid. And apparently there are two ways of learning the Ravid. One, Nechleku Amoraim le'inyan Ma'aseh Tal b'Omer Mutter lo. The Ravid Kishitas Chizkiya Shetmura Chala. Again, this is all in Tmura Masech Tmura Daf Yud Zayin. So we're saying that the Ma'aseh Tmura is valid both in the case of Shlomim and Ola and in the case of Omer Mutter. But now we have another interpretation of the Ravid. So there was a machlokus about Omer Mutter, whether the Ma'aseh Tmura is valid or not. And we paskin like that, that the Tmura is valid, or there was never a machlokus, and certainly Omer Mutter is a valid Tmura. I personally understand the second interpretation a lot better than the first, because I don't see why Omer Mutter should be a factor that should kick in here and perhaps undermine the Chalos Tmura. Now he has a Tosus here. Okay, so there was never a machlokas, and there are two categories and cases of tos, and they're both valid in Tmura. Now we get to the next paragraph. Here I will say this is very interesting. Hertzu, as we say. What happens if the man wants to back out of his Ma'aseh Tmura? Can a person cancel his Ma'aseh Tmura? In general, in Kinyonim, and in other cases, we have what's called Chazara Tov Kidei Dibur. So a person is given, so to speak, a right to rescind his statement, his declaration, within a certain period of time, very short period of time. And the question is, does that apply to Hekdeshos in general and to Tmura specifically? So a man says, Harei zu Tmura zu. No, I changed my mind. I cancel my order. She'ela v'tov kidei dibur. Now he adds another issue. In Hekdeshos, as Nidarim, there's something called She'ela. So you can come in front of a Chacham and you could renege your declaration. So we have two issues now. Number one, can he himself renege his declaration of Tmura immediately after he made the declaration? And number two, can he take that Tmura in front of a chacham, or maybe he needs a beis din, I don't know, in front of a tribunal of 3 judges and say, you know what, I want to be shoel. I want to cancel my tmur. So I'm going to tell you, Rabosa, without looking, that I don't believe. Again, I don't know about Tochidei Dibra, I don't know. But as far as She'ela is concerned, I don't believe for 1 minute that She'ela could work. Why? Because how does She'ela work in Nidar? I come in front of the tribunal and I say, look, if I would have known that I have this tremendous desire to smoke, I never would have taken a neder not to smoke. So there's something missing in my original awareness when I took the neder. But in Tvura, that's irrelevant. Because in Tvura, even if you made a toast, you didn't know it was also, and you wouldn't have taken it, or you didn't know it was shlomo that would come out of my mouth. I thought it was ola that would come out. It's always Tvura, it's always valid. But that's as far as She'ela is concerned. But as far as Tochdei Dibur, then I think it would depend upon the following. How do you understand Tochdei Dibur? Chazara Tochdei Dibur, is it a right, a schus that we give a person? Or does it remove the Dibur itself? See, if it removes the Dibur, it should work in all Ekdeshos and in Tvur as well. But if it's a separate schus, I don't have that schus. Why? Because the animal is already hegdish. I can't change that reality. All right, let's see what he says. Ein nisholam ala Tvura. Shemeyachesh atmur chala af betos and kain af lefi she'elaso she'tos ha'isaviyad. He comes in front of the tribunal and he says, Rabbosai, if only I had known X, Y, or Z, I never would have taken this tmura, and the Maisa tmura was done betos. It doesn't matter because we already have a ribui that tells us that a Maisa tmura betos is valid. In kain af lefi she'elaso she'tos ha'isaviyad become chala tmura. So far, so good. Sadi Zayir, Yerushalmi. All right. Oh, the Yerushalmi says, Kol Ama Modi, meaning Kuli Ama Modi, She'ein Nisholim Ala Tmur. It seems that the Rambam codifies this in Hilchos Nidarim. That would be a fascinating research project. Why in Nidarim and not in Hilchos Tmur? Hatzu Achronu, She'im Heimner Karban, V'chazer Bo Toch Kidei Dibur. Oh, this is already more complicated. But boss, I think we should leave this for tomorrow. Let's just make a note of where we got up to.